If kindness ever leaves your table, don't be surprised when destiny stops knocking at your door. The smell of warm apples, cinnamon, and buttery crust drifted through the crisp mountain air long before sunrise, wrapping itself around the sleepy little village of Pine Hollow like an invisible welcome. Emily Carter stood behind the worn wooden counter of her tiny bakery, brushing a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear as she carefully slid another golden pie onto the cooling rack. She had baked dozens of apple pies over the years, following the same recipe her grandmother had written on a faded recipe card splattered with flour and butter stains. The townsfolk often said her pies tasted like home, though most of them only bought one during holidays or special occasions. Business had never been easy. Some mornings she wondered whether the bakery would survive another winter, but every dawn she lit the oven anyway, believing that warm bread and sweet pies could make even the hardest day feel a little softer. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly beneath towering pine trees, their branches swaying gently beneath the early morning breeze. Travelers rarely wandered this far north unless they had lost their way, and children were almost never seen alone near the woods. That was why Emily noticed them immediately. Two small boys peeked around the corner of her bakery just as she finished arranging the fresh pies in the display window. They couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. Their silver blonde hair caught the morning sunlight, and their oversized sweaters looked as though they had been borrowed from someone much older. Their bright blue eyes remained fixed on the pies, especially the one cooling nearest the open window. They didn't speak. They simply stood there, trying very hard to pretend they weren't staring. Emily smiled to herself without letting them notice. She reached for a fresh pie, sliced 2 generous pieces, and placed them onto simple white plates. Then she stepped outside as if she had only come to sweep the front porch. "Good morning," she called gently. The boys jumped in surprise. One instinctively stepped in front of the other as though trying to protect his younger brother. Emily pretended not to notice. "I accidentally baked too much today," she said with a small shrug. "Would you help me keep these from going to waste?" The older boy hesitated. His eyes searched her face with surprising caution, as though he had learned that grown-ups often expected something in return for kindness. Emily simply held out the plates and waited. After several long seconds, the younger boy carefully accepted one slice with both hands. His eyes widened after the first bite. He looked at his brother, then back at Emily, wearing the kind of smile that couldn't be faked. The older boy finally accepted his own piece. Neither of them rushed. They ate slowly, savoring every bite as though warm apple pie were something they hadn't tasted in a very long time. Emily noticed their manners before anything else. They thanked her quietly. They brushed crumbs off the porch before standing. They even carried the empty plates back to her without being asked. Whoever had raised them had taught them kindness, even if life had become difficult afterward. "Do your parents know where you are?" Emily asked softly. The brothers exchanged a quick glance. The younger one lowered his head. The older answered politely, "We're just exploring." It wasn't really an answer, but Emily didn't press further. Some children carried worries too heavy for their age, and she had learned long ago that trust could never be hurried. She simply smiled and said, "Well, if you're ever hungry again, my oven starts warming before sunrise." The boys nodded eagerly. As they turned toward the edge of the forest, the younger one suddenly stopped. He looked back over his shoulder, clutching the last flaky bite of pie in his small hands. His voice was barely louder than the breeze. "Thank you, Miss Emily." Before she could answer, both boys disappeared between the tall pines, leaving only tiny footprints in the morning dew and one strange question quietly settling into Emily's heart. Why did 2 children who smiled so warmly always vanish back into the deepest part of the forest before anyone else could ever see them? The next morning, the sweet scent of apples drifted through Pine Hollow once again before the church bell rang 7 times, and Emily Carter found herself glancing toward the front window far more often than she cared to admit. She smiled at her own distraction while brushing melted butter across another row of pie crusts. It was silly, she told herself. Children wandered. Children forgot. Perhaps the 2 brothers had already continued wherever they had been headed. Still, before opening the bakery door, she quietly prepared 2 extra slices and placed them on a small wooden plate beside the window. Nearly an hour passed before she noticed 2 familiar silver blonde heads peeking cautiously from behind the same weathered fence across the road. This time they did not step any closer. They simply watched the bakery as though making certain it was safe. Emily pretended not to notice them at first. She greeted her regular customers, wrapped fresh bread in brown paper, accepted a handful of dollar bills and loose change, and wished everyone a pleasant morning. Only after the last customer left did she carry the waiting plate outside. "Looks like I accidentally baked too much again," she said with the same gentle smile. The younger boy's face brightened immediately, but he looked toward his older brother before taking a single step. The older one studied Emily carefully, then nodded once. They approached together. "Good morning," Emily said. "Good morning, Miss Emily." They answered almost perfectly in unison. Their politeness made her laugh softly. She handed them the pie, noticing this time that their sweaters, although clean, were beginning to show loose threads around the sleeves. Their boots were sturdy but worn, carrying tiny pine needles and dried leaves that hinted they had spent many nights somewhere deep in the forest. "I never asked your names," Emily said as they settled onto the old bench outside the bakery. The older boy swallowed his first bite before answering. "I am Ethan." The younger smiled through a mouthful of apple pie before quickly remembering his manners. "And I am Noah." "Those are wonderful names," Emily replied warmly. "I am glad we are no longer strangers." Noah grinned so brightly that it seemed impossible not to smile back. Ethan remained quieter, but his shoulders gradually relaxed. They talked about simple things while the morning sun climbed higher above the pines. Emily asked whether they liked the changing leaves. Noah declared that squirrels always stole the biggest acorns. Ethan insisted that Noah had once tried to race a deer and had lost badly. Noah protested with embarrassed laughter while Emily covered her mouth to hide her own amusement. For a little while, they looked exactly like ordinary brothers enjoying an ordinary morning. Yet every now and then Emily noticed something unusual. Their hearing seemed remarkably sharp. Both boys would glance toward the woods several seconds before birds suddenly took flight. They tilted their heads whenever distant sounds drifted across the valley, as though they could hear conversations carried by the wind itself. Once, Noah suddenly froze with half a bite of pie still in his hand. His bright blue eyes shifted toward the tree line. Ethan quietly reached over and squeezed his little brother's arm. Whatever Noah had sensed, it passed just as quickly, and they continued eating as though nothing had happened. Emily said nothing. Every family had secrets they revealed only when they felt safe. She had no intention of stealing theirs. By late afternoon, the brothers stood to leave. Before they disappeared into the trees, Emily handed Ethan a small paper bag. "For later," she said. Ethan looked inside. 2 warm apple turnovers rested neatly beside one another. "Miss Emily," he began quietly, "you already gave us pie." Emily shrugged with an easy smile. Growing boys always get hungry again. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before carefully accepting the bag with both hands. "Thank you." After they disappeared into the forest, Emily swept the front porch while humming softly to herself. She almost missed the voices drifting from the nearby general store. "Have you noticed those strange boys?" one woman whispered. "They keep coming out of the woods." "Probably runaways," another replied. "Or wild children. Nobody knows where they sleep." "You should be careful, Emily," Mr. Dawson called kindly from across the street. "Children who hide usually have someone looking for them." Emily rested both hands on the broom handle and looked toward the silent forest where the brothers had vanished. "Maybe," she answered gently. "Or maybe they are simply waiting for someone who will ask their names before asking where they belong." The neighbors exchanged uncertain glances before returning to their conversations. As evening settled across Pine Hollow, Emily locked the bakery and carried a basket of leftover bread toward her little cottage behind the shop. The sky glowed with soft shades of gold and lavender, while the first stars slowly appeared above the endless sea of pine trees. Just before she reached her back porch, she noticed something resting neatly beside the doorstep. It was a tiny bundle of wildflowers tied together with a thin strip of grass. No note, no footprints she could clearly follow. Only a few pale feathers caught between the flowers and the morning's empty pie plate she had forgotten to bring inside. Emily picked up the little bouquet, smiling as warmth quietly settled in her heart. Somewhere beyond the darkening trees, 2 small brothers had remembered her kindness, and for reasons she could not yet explain, it felt as though this unexpected friendship was only the beginning of a much larger story. The little bouquet remained in a glass jar beside Emily Carter's kitchen window for 3 days, its tiny white blossoms somehow staying fresh far longer than wildflowers usually did. Every morning she smiled when sunlight spilled across the delicate petals while she kneaded dough, and every afternoon she found herself placing 2 extra pastries near the front window before the brothers even appeared. Ethan and Noah never came at exactly the same hour. Sometimes they arrived just after breakfast. Sometimes they wandered into town near sunset with pine needles tangled in their silver blonde hair and cheerful smiles that always seemed brighter after spending the day beneath the trees. They never asked for food, and Emily never made them feel as though they had to. She simply welcomed them with the same gentle warmth she offered every customer who stepped through her bakery door. Before long, the little wooden bench outside became their favorite place. Noah loved watching pie crusts rise inside the oven, while Ethan quietly asked questions about baking, carefully memorizing every answer as though each recipe were something precious. Emily laughed when Noah accidentally dusted flour across his nose, and even Ethan's serious expression softened enough for the corners of his mouth to lift. They looked less like strangers now and more like family friends who had somehow always belonged there. One cool October evening, the brothers lingered much later than usual. Thick gray clouds drifted across the mountains, covering the last golden light of sunset. Emily noticed Ethan studying the sky with unusual concern. Noah kept glancing toward the forest instead of finishing the warm cinnamon roll in his hands. "Is everything all right?" Emily asked gently. Ethan hesitated before answering. "We should leave before it gets dark. The trail is difficult at night," Noah added quietly. Emily nodded with understanding. "Then take these for your walk home." She filled another paper bag with fresh apple turnovers and warm rolls. Noah hugged the bag against his chest with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Miss Emily." They hurried toward the trees just as the first drops of rain began tapping against the bakery windows. Emily watched until the forest swallowed them from sight. A strong wind arrived only minutes later, carrying cold rain through Pine Hollow. She finished cleaning the bakery, locked the front door, and hurried toward her cottage with her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. Halfway across the yard she paused. Somewhere beyond the rain she heard a soft sound unlike anything she had heard before. It was not quite a bark, not quite a howl. It was smaller, gentler, almost like frightened puppies calling for one another beneath the steady rhythm of falling rain. Emily looked toward the dark forest. The sound came again. Without thinking twice, she grabbed an old wool blanket from her porch and carried a lantern toward the tree line. She did not wander far. The familiar path curved between towering pines before opening into a quiet clearing washed silver beneath the rising full moon. The rain had already begun to ease. "Ethan," she called softly. "Noah." No answer came. Only another tiny whimper reached her ears. She followed it until she stopped beside a fallen cedar log, and there her breath caught. Curled together beneath the shelter of low branches were 2 beautiful white wolf pups no larger than golden retriever puppies. Their thick silver-white fur glistened beneath the moonlight. Their bright blue eyes looked unmistakably familiar. One lifted his little head. The other immediately moved closer beside him. Emily stared for several long seconds as realization quietly settled into her heart. Those eyes, those expressions, the gentle way the larger one instinctively protected the smaller one. She knew them. The pups stared back nervously, waiting for fear that never came. Emily slowly lowered herself to one knee, carefully placing the lantern on the ground. "So this is your secret," she whispered with a soft smile that carried neither surprise nor judgment. The larger pup lowered his ears uncertainly. The smaller one gave a tiny, embarrassed sound before hiding his face against his brother's shoulder. Emily did not move any closer. Instead, she unfolded the wool blanket and spread it across the dry ground beneath the cedar branches. "It is going to be a cold night," she said gently. "You should stay warm." She stepped back several feet before turning away completely, giving them the privacy they seemed to need. After only a moment, she heard cautious little paws stepping onto the blanket. A quiet sigh followed. Emily smiled to herself without looking back. "Sleep well, boys," she whispered as she lifted the lantern once more and began walking toward home. Behind her, hidden beneath the ancient pines and glowing moonlight, 2 small white wolf pups watched her disappear down the trail, And for the very first time since they had entered Pine Hollow, neither of them wondered whether they had finally found someone they could trust. They already knew. Morning arrived wrapped in quiet mist, but something in Pine Hollow felt different. Emily Carter noticed it before the first customer stepped through her bakery door. Horses she could not yet see echoed somewhere beyond the hills. Birds that usually gathered near the forest edge had disappeared, leaving an unusual stillness hanging over the village. She brushed flour from her apron and looked toward the distant tree line, remembering the two white wolf pups curled safely beneath the blanket she had left for them the night before. They had trusted her with a secret beyond explanation, and somehow she felt responsible for protecting it, even if she did not fully understand it herself. By mid-morning, unfamiliar riders entered the village square. Their dark cloaks carried an elegant silver wolf embroidered across each shoulder, a symbol no one in Pine Hollow recognized, yet it immediately drew curious whispers from every direction. The riders did not behave like merchants or travelers. They spoke quietly among themselves while carefully studying every road leading toward the surrounding forests. Their horses remained calm despite the growing crowd gathering around them. Emily watched from her bakery window as Mr. Dawson crossed the street to greet the strangers. She could not hear every word, but one sentence drifted clearly across the cool autumn air. "We are searching for two young brothers," one rider explained politely. "They disappeared several days ago." Emily's hands paused over a fresh pie crust. Two brothers. Her thoughts immediately turned to Ethan and Noah. She told herself it might be coincidence. Countless families had children with similar ages. Still, an uneasy feeling settled quietly inside her heart. The riders continued asking questions throughout the village. Had anyone seen two boys traveling together? Silver blonde hair, bright blue eyes, exceptionally polite. They thanked every villager who answered, yet none of their smiles ever reached their eyes. Whatever mission had brought them here clearly carried great importance. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Noah arrived as they always had, though this time they seemed unusually cautious. Before stepping onto the bakery porch, both brothers carefully looked in every direction. Noah spotted one of the unfamiliar horses tied near the general store and immediately stopped walking. Ethan gently placed a reassuring hand on his younger brother's shoulder. Emily noticed the exchange without pretending otherwise. "You both look tired today," she said softly while placing two warm apple turnovers onto the counter. Noah forced a small smile, but his cheerful energy seemed dimmer than usual. Ethan glanced toward the village square before quietly asking, "Have strangers been here all day?" Emily nodded honestly. "They said they were searching for two boys." Silence settled between them. Noah lowered his eyes to the pastry in his hands. Ethan remained perfectly still for several seconds before offering a polite smile that looked much older than any child should have needed to wear. "Thank you for telling us," he said. Emily studied their faces with gentle concern. "Are they looking for you?" she asked carefully. The brothers exchanged another silent glance. Ethan finally answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "Some people worry because they care. Other people worry because they want control." Emily did not fully understand his words, yet she recognized the sadness hidden beneath them. She chose not to ask another question. Instead, she poured each boy a mug of warm apple cider and quietly placed a plate of cinnamon cookies between them. "You do not have to explain anything until you are ready," she said with a reassuring smile. Noah looked up first. Relief softened his young face. Ethan's shoulders relaxed just enough for Emily to notice. For a little while they spoke about ordinary things again. Noah proudly described a family of rabbits they had seen near a creek. Ethan asked whether pie dough always needed to rest before baking. Emily answered every question as though nothing unusual had happened outside her little bakery. Yet through the front window, she noticed two of the mounted strangers slowly riding past. One of them glanced toward the bakery, his eyes lingering for only a brief moment before continuing down the street. Ethan noticed them too. He quietly reached for Noah's hand beneath the table. Emily pretended not to see. As the afternoon faded into evening, the brothers stood to leave much earlier than normal. Emily packed fresh bread, apple turnovers, and 2 small jars of homemade blackberry jam into a cloth bag. "For breakfast tomorrow," she said. Noah hugged the bag tightly against his chest. "Miss Emily?" he asked softly. "Yes. If someone asks about us." He hesitated, searching for the right words. Emily gently rested her hand over his small one. I will never tell a story that is not mine to tell. Noah smiled with visible relief. Ethan met her eyes, and for the first time there was complete trust in his expression. Without another word, the brothers hurried toward the forest just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. Emily watched until they vanished among the pines once again. Only after they were gone did another rider quietly guide his horse into the village square. Unlike the others, he spoke to no one. He simply looked toward the dark forest with calm, unwavering focus, as though he already knew the search was leading exactly where it needed to go. The following morning, Pine Hollow no longer felt like the peaceful village Emily Carter had known her entire life. People gathered in small circles outside the general store, speaking in lowered voices whenever the unfamiliar riders passed by. Every conversation seemed to end the same way. 2 missing boys. A growing search. More strangers arriving before sunset. Emily tried to focus on rolling pie dough across her flour-covered counter, but her thoughts kept drifting toward Ethan and Noah. She had not seen them since the evening before, and the empty bench outside her bakery somehow looked lonelier than usual. Shortly after noon, another group of mounted visitors entered the village. Unlike the first riders, these men and women wore traveling cloaks instead of polished uniforms, but each carried the same silver wolf emblem stitched onto the shoulder. They spoke politely to every shopkeeper, studying footprints along the roads and quietly examining the edge of the forest. One customer leaned across Emily's counter and whispered, "People say those children are more important than anyone realized." Emily simply smiled politely and handed over a warm loaf of bread. She had no interest in rumors. All she knew was that 2 kind-hearted boys had shared her table, thanked her for every meal, and left wildflowers on her doorstep. That was enough for her. As afternoon faded, Emily packed a small basket with fresh apple turnovers, homemade rolls, sliced cheddar cheese, and 2 shiny red apples. She wrapped everything inside a clean linen cloth before quietly slipping out the back door toward the familiar forest trail. She did not know whether the brothers would be waiting, but she trusted her heart enough to try. The woods greeted her with cool autumn air carrying the scent of pine and damp leaves. Sunlight filtered gently through the tall branches, painting golden patches across the winding path. She reached the little clearing where she had discovered the white wolf pups only nights before. At first the clearing seemed empty. Then 2 familiar figures stepped cautiously from behind a cluster of cedar trees. Ethan smiled with visible relief. Noah ran forward before stopping himself halfway, remembering his careful manners. Emily laughed softly. I had a feeling someone might have skipped lunch today. Noah's eyes immediately found the basket. Did you bring apple turnovers? Emily raised an eyebrow. Perhaps. Noah grinned so brightly that Ethan could not help smiling too. They settled beneath the old cedar tree, sharing the simple meal while soft breezes rustled through the branches overhead. For a little while it felt as though the outside world no longer existed. Noah happily described a family of bluebirds nesting nearby. Ethan quietly thanked Emily for remembering that he preferred the crust pieces because they stayed crisp longer. Small details, ordinary moments, the kind that slowly turned strangers into something much closer. Then the peaceful silence broke. Distant voices drifted through the trees. They were not shouting, only calling carefully from different directions. Emily recognized none of the words, but Ethan's expression changed instantly. Noah's cheerful smile disappeared. Both brothers stood at the same moment. They are closer today, Ethan said quietly. Emily looked toward the sound. Through the trees, she could just make out several figures walking carefully between the pines, examining the ground as they moved. They still remained far away, but they were searching this part of the forest now. Noah instinctively reached for Ethan's hand. Emily saw genuine worry on both young faces. She knelt beside them, so her eyes met theirs. Listen to me, she said gently. No matter who is looking, you should never be afraid simply because someone is calling your name. But you also do not have to walk toward people until you know they are truly safe. Ethan studied her quietly. You still trust us? Emily answered without hesitation. You have never given me a reason not to. Something softened in Ethan's eyes. Noah smiled, though only a little. Emily carefully closed the basket and looked toward a narrow trail leading deeper between the towering pines. Go where you feel safest, she told them calmly. I will stay here. The brothers hesitated only a second before slipping silently into the forest. Their footsteps faded almost immediately, leaving only the whisper of wind moving through the branches. A few minutes later, three searchers entered the clearing. Their expressions remained courteous, though their attention quickly settled on the empty picnic blanket, the half-finished pastries, and the warm basket beside Emily. One of them offered a respectful nod. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Have you happened to see two young boys in these woods?" Emily met his eyes with calm honesty. "I have shared food with hungry children before," she replied gently. "Every child deserves kindness." The searcher looked around the quiet clearing once more before giving a thoughtful nod. "If you see them again, please let them know that someone has been searching every road, every village, and every forest because they wish to bring them home." Emily watched the three strangers disappear among the trees. Their voices slowly faded into the distance. She remained beneath the cedar for another quiet minute, listening to the wind. Somewhere beyond the endless pines, hidden from every searching eye, two small brothers had heard every word. And for the first time, Emily began wondering whether the home everyone was searching for was truly the one Ethan and Noah wanted to return to. The next morning, dawn arrived beneath a blanket of silver fog that settled softly over Pine Hollow, muting every sound except the steady rhythm of Emily Carter's rolling pin moving across her wooden counter. She had barely finished placing a fresh apple pie into the oven when the familiar feeling returned. Someone was watching the bakery. It was not an uncomfortable feeling. It was patient, quiet, almost hopeful. She glanced toward the front window, but the bench outside remained empty. Even so, she prepared 2 slices of pie, 2 mugs of warm cider, and set them on the little table beside the window exactly as she had every day. Hours slipped by without a sign of Ethan or Noah. The empty chairs slowly cooled, and for the first time since meeting the brothers, Emily wondered whether they had finally decided it was too dangerous to return. She tried to convince herself that they were safe somewhere deep inside the forest, yet an uneasy feeling lingered in her chest. Just after noon, an unusual silence spread across the village. Conversations stopped almost at once. Shopkeepers stepped outside their doors. Even the horses tied near the general store stood unusually still, their ears pointed toward the northern road. Emily walked onto her front porch, brushing flour from her hands. A single rider approached at a calm, steady pace. Unlike the others who had searched the village over the past several days, this man wore no elaborate armor and carried no banners. His long charcoal coat moved gently with the autumn breeze, and the powerful black horse beneath him seemed to need no reins at all. The rider carried himself with quiet confidence rather than display. His dark hair stirred lightly in the wind, and his silver-gray eyes calmly observed every corner of the village without appearing hurried. People instinctively stepped aside as he passed. No one told them to move. Somehow they simply did. Emily watched with quiet curiosity. He did not look angry. He did not look impatient. Instead, he looked like a father who had spent far too many sleepless nights searching for something precious. The rider stopped directly in front of her bakery. Before either of them could speak, 2 familiar voices echoed from the edge of the forest. "Miss Emily," Noah shouted with unmistakable excitement. Emily turned toward the sound, just as Noah burst from between the pine trees, Ethan only a step behind him. Both boys ran across the open grass as quickly as their little legs could carry them. Emily smiled with overwhelming relief. "You came back," she said softly. She barely had time to kneel before Noah threw his arms around her shoulders. Ethan arrived a heartbeat later, wrapping one arm around her while trying to pretend he was too grown up for hugs. Emily laughed warmly, holding both boys close. "I was beginning to worry." Noah looked up with complete innocence. "We missed your pies." Ethan nodded. "And we missed you." Emily's eyes softened. "I missed you too." Only then did she notice how completely silent the entire village had become. She slowly lifted her head. The mysterious rider had dismounted. He stood only a few yards away, watching the 3 of them with an expression Emily could not immediately understand. It was relief, gratitude, disbelief, all woven together behind remarkably calm eyes. Noah suddenly noticed him as well. His face lit up brighter than Emily had ever seen before. "Father," he cried. In an instant, both brothers released Emily and ran toward the man. Ethan reached him first, followed immediately by Noah. The rider knelt and embraced them both with quiet tenderness. resting a hand on each small shoulder as though reassuring himself they were truly safe. Emily smiled, believing the mystery had finally been solved. Their father had found them. Around the village square, however, something entirely different happened. Every rider who had spent days searching the countryside immediately lowered his head. The villagers stared in confusion as each of the strangers stepped forward and respectfully bowed. Even the horses seemed strangely still. Mr. Dawson removed his cap without hesitation. The silence became so complete that Emily could hear nothing except the gentle rustling of autumn leaves overhead. She looked from the bowed riders to the man holding Ethan and Noah, then back again. The realization had not yet reached her, but it had reached everyone else. The man slowly stood, keeping one reassuring hand on each boy's shoulder before lifting his calm silver gaze toward Emily. His voice was deep, steady, and carried the quiet authority of someone long accustomed to responsibility rather than power. "Miss Emily Carter," he said with sincere warmth. "My name is Lucian Ashford." He paused only briefly before adding the words that caused every person in Pine Hollow to lower their eyes in astonishment. "I have come to thank the woman who cared for my sons." In that single breathtaking moment, Emily finally understood why an entire kingdom had been searching the forests, why the riders had never stopped looking, and why two gentle little boys had always carried themselves with kindness far beyond their years. Ethan and Noah were not simply lost brothers. They were the young princes of the Wolf Kingdom, and the man standing before her was the Alpha King himself. Emily Carter remained standing on the bakery porch, unable to speak as the truth settled gently over everything she thought she understood. Ethan and Noah stood proudly beside King Lucian Ashford now, yet they kept glancing back at her with the same familiar smiles that had greeted her every morning outside the bakery. Nothing about the boys themselves had changed. They were still the children who politely returned empty plates, thanked her for every slice of pie, and left little bouquets of wildflowers on her doorstep. The only thing that had changed was the world suddenly realizing who they truly were. The villagers slowly lowered their heads in respect, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. King Lucian broke the silence first. His voice carried calm strength rather than command. "Please," he said gently, looking around the gathering crowd. "Today I came as a father before I came as your king." Those simple words seemed to ease the tension filling the square. Emily finally found her voice. "Your Majesty, I did not know." Lucian's expression softened. "I know." There was no accusation in his eyes, only quiet gratitude. Noah suddenly tugged on his father's sleeve with unmistakable excitement. "Father, tell her." Lucian looked down with a faint smile. "Tell her what?" Noah grinned. "Why we kept coming back." Ethan let out a quiet sigh, though the corners of his mouth lifted. "You promised you would let me explain." Lucian nodded. "Then go ahead." Ethan stepped toward Emily, suddenly looking less like a prince and more like the thoughtful little boy who had carefully memorized pie recipes beside her oven. "The first day we came here," he began softly, "we had been walking for hours." Noah eagerly continued before his brother could finish. "We smelled apples before we saw your bakery." Emily smiled. "That was the fresh pie." Noah nodded enthusiastically. "We almost left because we thought someone would chase us away." Emily's heart tightened. "Why would you think that?" Noah looked down at his boots. "Because everyone kept looking for princes." He paused before lifting his bright blue eyes toward hers. "You were the first person who only saw two hungry boys." Complete silence settled over Pine Hollow once again. Even the autumn breeze seemed to pause between the towering pines. Ethan quietly continued. Everywhere else people bowed. They worried about rules. They watched every word they spoke. He glanced toward the bakery window where two untouched slices of pie still rested on the little table. "You never asked whether we were important." Emily answered with a gentle smile. "You were important." Ethan blinked in surprise. Emily continued. "Every child is." Noah's face brightened immediately. He looked at his father with unmistakable excitement. "See? I told you." Lucian watched the exchange without interrupting. There was something deeply thoughtful in his silver-gray eyes now, as though he were witnessing far more than a simple conversation. Noah suddenly laughed. "Father, tell her what I said after the first pie." Lucian chuckled quietly, the sound surprising nearly everyone present. He declared that if the royal palace baked pies like Miss Emily's, he would never have wandered into the forest. The villagers exchanged amused smiles. Noah nodded proudly. It is true. Ethan folded his arms with playful dignity. You actually said her pies felt warmer than the palace. Noah looked completely unashamed. Because they did. Emily felt unexpected tears gathering in her eyes. It was only pie, she whispered. Lucian gently shook his head. No, Miss Carter. His voice became quieter. It was welcome. He glanced toward his sons with unmistakable affection. These two have lived surrounded by guards, advisors, ceremonies, and expectations since the day they were born. Everywhere they go, people remember they are princes. His gaze returned to Emily. You remembered they were children. Emily lowered her eyes, humbled by his words. I simply gave them something to eat. Lucian smiled faintly. Sometimes the smallest kindness becomes the place someone remembers when they need comfort the most. Noah suddenly reached into his pocket and carefully unfolded a slightly wrinkled piece of paper. It was covered with uneven pencil sketches of pies, little wolves, and smiling stick figures standing outside a tiny bakery. At the center he had written in large careful letters, Home. Emily covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Noah handed her the drawing with complete sincerity. I made it after the second day, he said softly. Because every time Ethan asked where we should go next, I always wanted to come back here. Emily accepted the little drawing with trembling hands, realizing that while an entire kingdom had been searching for its missing princes, the two boys had quietly been searching for something entirely different. They had not been looking for another castle. They had simply been looking for a place where someone cared more about whether they had eaten than whether they wore a crown. The afternoon sunlight slowly settled across Pine Hollow, casting long golden shadows between the little bakery and the village square, yet no one seemed eager to leave. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on King Lucian Ashford, the two young princes, and the quiet baker who had unknowingly become the center of a story that would be remembered for generations. Emily Carter still held Noah's drawing carefully against her chest, as though it were the most valuable thing she had ever received. She had no words grand enough to answer the trust those two children had placed in her, so she simply smiled through eyes that shimmered with quiet emotion. After several peaceful moments, one of the royal attendants stepped forward carrying an elegant wooden chest reinforced with polished silver corners. He respectfully bowed before the king before placing the chest upon a small table beside the bakery porch. The lid opened slowly, revealing neatly stacked gold coins, velvet pouches, and several beautifully carved jewelry boxes that sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. A soft murmur spread through the gathered villagers. Few people in Pine Hollow had ever seen such wealth gathered in one place. The attendant stepped back while Lucian addressed Emily with calm sincerity. Miss Carter, he said, there is no reward large enough to repay someone who protected my sons without expecting anything in return. Even so, I ask you to accept this small expression of my family's gratitude. Emily looked from the overflowing chest to the king, then toward Ethan and Noah. The brothers watched her hopefully, but neither seemed interested in the treasure. They only wanted to know what she would say. Emily slowly shook her head. Your Majesty, she answered gently, I cannot accept it. A wave of surprised whispers passed through the crowd. The royal attendant looked uncertain, as though no one had ever refused a gift from the Alpha King before. Lucian himself appeared quietly surprised, though not offended. May I ask why? He said. Emily folded Noah's drawing carefully before slipping it into her apron pocket. Because I never baked those pies for princes. She smiled softly at Ethan and Noah. I baked them for two hungry little boys who happened to stop outside my window. Noah's eyes immediately filled with emotion. Ethan lowered his head, smiling quietly to himself. Emily continued, her voice remaining gentle and steady. If I had known who they were, perhaps I would have worried about saying the wrong thing or serving the meal perfectly. Instead, I simply treated them the way every child deserves to be treated. That is not something I should be paid for. Silence settled once more across the square. Even the royal guard standing behind their king seemed deeply moved by her words. Lucian studied Emily for several thoughtful seconds before slowly closing the treasure chest himself. Then you have reminded me of something I should never have forgotten, he said quietly. Emily tilted her head slightly. Lucian glanced toward his sons. A kingdom can provide comfort. It can provide education, protection, and every luxury imaginable. But none of those things can replace simple kindness freely given. Noah reached for his father's hand, while Ethan looked proudly toward Emily. One elderly woman from the village wiped tears from her eyes before smiling warmly. Mr. Dawson quietly removed his hat once more, not because a king stood before him this time, but because genuine goodness had revealed itself in someone he had known for years. Lucian stepped closer to Emily, stopping at a respectful distance. "Very well," he said with a faint smile. "If you will not accept gold, then I will honor your wishes." He turned toward his attendants. "The bakery in Pine Hollow will receive the finest flour, fresh apples, butter, spices, and baking supplies every harvest season, not as payment, but as a standing royal purchase. Every pie baked here will feed this village first, and every remaining pie will be delivered to the orphan homes throughout the kingdom in Miss Carter's name." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "Your Majesty," Lucian gently raised one hand. "No child who visits your door should ever hear the words, 'We have nothing left to bake today.'" Noah clapped happily before throwing his arms around Emily once again. "Now everyone can have pie," he declared with complete satisfaction. Ethan laughed softly beside them. Emily embraced both boys, realizing the king had understood her heart perfectly. He had not tried to buy her kindness. Instead, he had chosen to help it reach farther than she ever could alone. And as warm afternoon lights settled across the little bakery, the people of Pine Hollow quietly realized they were witnessing something even rarer than royal generosity. They were watching kindness inspire kindness, until it became large enough to nourish an entire kingdom. The royal procession remained in Pine Hollow until the evening sky turned shades of amber and deep violet, yet no one seemed eager to end the extraordinary day. The villagers slowly returned to their homes carrying a story they knew would one day be told to their grandchildren, while Ethan and Noah refused to wander more than a few steps away from Emily Carter. Noah proudly carried another warm apple turnover wrapped in brown paper, and Ethan quietly helped Emily stack empty pie plates inside the bakery exactly as he had done before anyone knew he was a prince. Watching them laugh together, King Lucian Ashford realized that for the first time in many months, his sons looked completely carefree. There were no tutors reminding them of royal etiquette, no formal ceremonies waiting beyond the next door, no endless lessons about duty and leadership. There was only the comforting scent of cinnamon, warm bread cooling on wooden racks, and a woman who had welcomed them without expecting anything in return. As twilight settled over the village, Lucian stepped inside the little bakery while the boys admired fresh loaves arranged on the shelves. The quiet room glowed beneath soft lantern light, making the polished wood and cooling pies feel warmer than ever. Emily finished tying an apron around a basket of bread that would be delivered to an elderly neighbor the following morning. She looked up as Lucian approached. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Silence felt surprisingly comfortable. Finally, Lucian smiled. "Miss Carter, I have one more request." Emily folded her hands politely. "Of course, Your Majesty." He shook his head gently. "When we first met, you did not know I was a king. I appreciated that very much. If we are speaking here, among the scent of fresh bread and apple pies, I would rather you simply call me Lucian." Emily hesitated before offering a small smile. "Only if you promise to continue calling me Emily." A quiet laugh escaped him. "Agreed." Noah suddenly hurried over carrying his empty plate. "Father, tell her." Lucian looked amused. "You seem determined that I tell her many things today." Noah nodded enthusiastically. "The important one." Ethan smiled knowingly, but allowed his younger brother to continue. Lucian looked back toward Emily. "Every season the royal palace hosts a harvest gathering for children from every village across the kingdom. It began years ago as a tradition, but over time it became little more than another formal celebration." He paused before continuing. "This year I would like it to become something different." Emily listened quietly. "Would you come to the palace and bake with our royal kitchen?" he asked. "Not as a servant, not as a royal baker, as our honored guest." Emily blinked in surprise. "Me?" Noah answered before his father could. "The pies taste better when you make them." Ethan nodded in agreement. "And every child should know what home tastes like." Emily felt her heart tighten once again. She looked around her tiny bakery, at the worn wooden shelves her grandfather had built decades earlier, at the flour-dusted counter where countless mornings had begun before sunrise. This little place had been her whole world for so long. Yet perhaps kindness was never meant to remain inside one small building forever. She looked back at Lucian. If it means more children leave with full stomachs and happy memories, then I would be honored to come. Noah cheered so loudly that several villagers outside laughed. Ethan smiled with quiet satisfaction while Lucian offered a grateful nod. Then it is settled. Over the following weeks, word of the Pine Hollow Bakery spread farther than anyone could have imagined. Travelers arrived not because they wanted to see the place where a king had once stood, but because they had heard about the woman who believed no child should ever be turned away hungry. Every season wagons filled with fresh apples, flour, butter, and spices arrived exactly as promised. Every month baskets of warm bread and pies traveled from Emily's ovens to villages throughout the kingdom. Whenever Ethan and Noah could escape their lessons, they returned to Pine Hollow, sometimes wearing simple clothes once again so they could spend ordinary afternoons helping knead dough, carrying baskets, and laughing beside the same wooden bench where everything had begun. And every time the brothers prepared to leave, Noah would always ask the same hopeful question. Will there be apple pie when we come back? Emily always smiled before answering. There will always be enough for both of you. Lucian would watch those simple exchanges with quiet gratitude, understanding that crowns could inspire respect, but kindness inspired something far more lasting. On the first evening of the next autumn harvest, as lanterns glowed beneath a sky full of brilliant stars, and the comforting scent of fresh apple pies drifted through the palace gardens, Lucian caught Emily's eyes across the gathering. Neither of them needed to say a word. Sometimes destiny did not arrive with thunder, ceremonies, or grand declarations. Sometimes it simply began with two hungry little boys, a warm slice of apple pie, and a woman who chose compassion before questions.